and today we will have a session titled Engaging Students from Differing and Different Disciplines Within a Course by Dr. Xiang. Before we begin, I will just make a few announcements for today's session. We will be recording this webinar session, and to view all our past recordings, you may use the link that's shared on the slide now, which is tinyurl.com/CTLP webinar, where you can view all our past sessions. And during today's session, if you have any questions, you may use the Q&A function or the raise hands to ask questions. Likewise, you can type your questions or comments in the chat, and we will get to it during the Q&A. We also invite all of you to our Inspire social media channel. You can scan the QR code to access the various platforms that we have, and we have a variety of teaching and learning content shared through these platforms. We also invite you to share any feedback you have with us using the QR code here and the link for today's session. We also invite you to share any kind of content or topics that you may be keen to learn or have other faculty talk about. Or similarly, if you'd like to use our webinar as a platform to share, we invite you to reach out to us and we'll contact you. So we'll get into today's session. Today we have Dr. Xiang will be sharing with us. Xiang is currently a lecturer at the School of Social Sciences at NTU. His works has been published in the Asian Journal of Political Science and the International Review of Public Administration and Relevance. His research interests include applied ethics, public policy governance, dynamics of motivation, philosophy and politics in public administration, further in climate change and artificial intelligence policy, quite a wide range of interests. And his recent work is a book chapter on a methodological framework combining experimental and qualitative research elements for motivation in public administration research. So I'd like to hand over to Xiang to begin today's session.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. So I think I will share my screen now, and I'll just check if everyone can see the slides. So just kindly bear with me on that. Right. Can everyone see my slides and hear me?
Yeah, we see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So let me just put the slideshow. Okay, are the slides good?
Yes, it's
okay.
Presenting.
All right. Thank you. Thanks very much, Xiang, for the very kind introduction. So again, just to share with everyone, thank you, rather to ease everyone into today's webinar. Thank you very much for your time. And very good morning to everyone. Before we carry on, I recognize that this is quite a busy period of the semester, right? Or those of us who are engaged with grading and exams, tests, and so on. So today's session will be, something that's not so heavy in terms of me just, sort of presenting. Right, I aim to allow for quite a bit of time for Q&A. So questions and answers. So feel free, right, to come up with whatever any question, any comment that you may have for the webinar at the end, and then at the end of the webinar we can get to that. So again, thank you very much for those who just came in. I'm Dr. Kwa from the School of Social Sciences, Public Policy and Global Affairs Program. Today's webinar will be focusing very specifically on actionable strategies, right? So just to align, orientate everyone to today's topic for today's webinar, the title is Engaging Students from Differing and Different Disciplines Within a Course, Strategies with the Potential to Positively Impact SFT Ratings and Learning Outcomes. Right. So if my voice cuts off or if the slide disappears from your end, please kindly feel free to alert me. Then we will restore the slides and or recording, right? Or the audio output. So agenda for today is relatively straightforward, nothing too heavy, right? I will first cover on what are the objectives that this webinar aims to achieve, and then we will go straight to actionable strategies, right? So this whole webinar is designed to be very systematic and succinct, right? So the actionable strategies will be, sort of outlined very clearly slide by slide. So as you can see on this agenda slide here, right, the actionable strategies that we will aim to cover are, communicating clear expectations clearly, maintaining instructor presence, maintaining approachability, and finally communicating real-time feedback clearly. So we'll go through these actionable strategies step by step, right, and then we will end off with Q&A, right? So I guess it's timely for myself to outline the objectives of this webinar. More specifically, right, I will aim to outline what this webinar is not trying to achieve or do, and instead what this webinar is trying to achieve or do, right? So I'll start off with the part about what this webinar is not trying to do, right? So first and foremost, this webinar is not trying to prescribe any strategies for any discipline, right? So as mentioned in the brief or the synopsis for today's webinar, right, the strategies that are proposed or suggested in this webinar are discipline neutral. They are not discipline specific and should not be understood in that way, right? So therefore, this webinar is not trying to prescribe any definite strategies for any discipline, right? At least for myself, right, I do recognize that different disciplines have, different content orientations or different kinds of content that is being taught to students. And with that, the kind of pedagogies that are used to deliver the content will differ accordingly, right? So in recognition of that, this webinar is first and foremost not trying to prescribe any definite strategies for any discipline, right? Next, also, this webinar is not trying to present the actionable strategies as exhaustive strategies, right? This webinar doesn't contain the be-all and end-all, right? It doesn't contain everything that we can understand as, actionable, effective strategies, right? There are definitely more actionable and effective strategies in terms of pedagogy, right? That lie outside the scope of this webinar. So by no means is this webinar trying to say that, look, these are the exhaustive strategies that we have in terms of pedagogy, right, on how to engage students or deliver content effectively. By no means this webinar is trying to do that. The next thing that this webinar is not trying to do is to advance a certain pedagogical principle or concept on teaching, right? This webinar is focused on very actionable, practical strategies, right? To help to potentially help to drive engagement in students towards the content as well as towards the respective learning objectives, right? This webinar is not trying to propose or advance a certain concept on pedagogy, a certain principle of pedagogy based on previous pedagogical research and so forth, right? That's not what this webinar is trying to do, right? There is definitely a purpose as well as a motivation for that, and there's definitely there is a cause for advancing, right, or for having webinars that advance a certain pedagogical principles or teaching concepts, but it's not covered in this webinar. That's not the aim of today's webinar, right? And finally, last but not least, on the first part of this slide, this webinar is also not trying to prove or disprove any existing teaching method or strategy, right? At least for myself, right, I recognize that, that there are already, right, effective pedagogical strategies that are out there for, various or even any discipline, right, that is covered within NTU. So what this webinar is not trying to do is to prove or disprove, right, any existing teaching method or strategy, right? That's not what this webinar is trying to do. So what is this webinar trying to do, right? In contrast, this webinar is trying to present succinct, actionable, and discipline-neutral strategies. Oops, like that, right? succinct, actionable, and discipline neutral strategies, right? And following on from that, right, this webinar is trying to present these strategies as non-exhaustive, right? And also, this webinar is trying to portray these strategies as complementary to existing approaches, right? So let me just touch on this third point here a little bit, right? This webinar is trying to show how the actionable strategies that are suggested here, right, within this session can complement or support or even lend greater insight, right, or help to strengthen even, right, even in a policy sense or in a procedural sense, existing approaches or strategies that already work for whatever disciplines that we are in, right? So that's what this webinar is trying to do in terms of the actionable strategies that is putting forth. Finally, this webinar hopes to serve as a practical and brief reference guide on these strategies. So these webinar slides are organized point by point, right, in point form, and also in terms of what kind of actions that we can take as course instructors or as course leads or as course coordinators, right, or as course planners or as course designers, whatever capacity we may be in, right, in terms of teaching and learning, right, on how we can, execute or implement these strategies, right? So this set of slides is designed to serve as a brief and reference guide, and it is therefore written in that way, right? So you will not find long chunks of paragraphs in this slide, right? They are organized in point form, right? Based specifically in terms of what we can do, right? So actionable pointers, actionable strategies that we can take to try to, improve engagement in students towards the course content as well as the course learning objectives respectively. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just jump right into the first actionable strategy for today, right? Before I carry on with the actionable strategies, right? These actionable strategies, as mentioned in the synopsis on the advert for today's webinar, right? It stems from my own experience of running social science environments or social science classroom environments that feature students not only from the social sciences, but from a wide variety of fields or disciplines. So in my own teaching experience, I've taught undergraduate students as well as returning students. So students of adult age, right? Or those who are returning to university from after many years in the industry, right? So the age range that I've taught include, the late teens, 18, 19 to about, I think my oldest student was about 40, touching 50 years old, right? So I teach them, social science topics that Jing Yuan sort of earlier introduced, right? Before we started the webinar. So yes, my students come from a whole range of disciplines, not just the social sciences, right? So the actionable strategies that I'll be sharing today stem from my classroom experiences, right, with those students. So therefore, although the actionable strategies that I'm proposing today stem from, that experience, these strategies are not specific to any discipline, right, or applicable to any specific discipline. They are instead discipline neutral, right? So yes, they are broad, right, but they are also succinct, and they also try to achieve the actionable strategies that I'm proposing here, right? They also try to achieve a specific objective in terms of trying to potentially raise students' engagement in the classroom towards the course content as well as towards the course learning objectives, and hopefully potentially raise, of course, SFT performance, right? Because I think all of us, especially those of us who are faculty here, right, we are assessed not just in terms of our research output. I myself, although I'm a lecturer, I'm also active in research, right? But we are also assessed based on our teaching performance, right? So NTU uses, partly, right, the SFT system, right, where students complete a closed-ended survey, right? And then in a way, our teaching performance is to a notable degree, right, assessed partly based on, the ratings that we receive for our SFTs, right? So today's webinar, right, is meant to, again, provide or present or suggest, right, actionable strategies to help us achieve potentially, right, help us achieve potentially, right, better SFT ratings, right, through greater engagement in students towards the course content and towards the course learning objectives. So that's where these actionable strategies are coming from, right, in terms of context. So back to the actionable strategies, right? The first actionable strategy that I've learned and I've applied in my own experience is communicating clear expectations clearly, right? So first and foremost, there are some words here that require further definition, right? So one, of course, is expectations. What do we mean by expectations, right? So expectations can mean a lot of different things in a course setting or a module setting. First and foremost, of course, expectations include assignment expectations, right? So this is something that we are all very familiar with. So what do we expect from students in terms of the assignments that they're supposed to complete, and how are they supposed to complete the assignments that they are expected to complete? So assignment expectations, right? The next kind of expectations are perhaps something that it's at least to me, and I believe to many of us, in fact, most if not all of us even, very evident, but perhaps may not readily come to our mind when we think about expectations in a course setting, right? And that is behavioral expectations, right? So behavioral expectations for tutorial, lecture, seminar, lab, what does this mean specifically, right? So behavioral expectations, right? Of course, it includes how one should communicate between the instructor and the student, or how students should communicate with the instructor and vice versa, but also how students should communicate amongst themselves, right? Whether or not the session is discussion heavy or not discussion heavy is besides the point, because even in a non-discussion heavy kind of session, there will be instances where students might talk to each other to clarify certain questions on the sums or on the assignment prompts or the lab experiments that they're supposed to do. So how should that happen, right? In such a setting, right? And how does and what expectations do the instructor have, right, for such behavioral expectations within the lesson setting? So that's another example of expectations in a course setting, right, which should be clear in the first instance and should also be communicated clearly, right? And this ties in also, of course, to communication expectations, right? So communication expectations, right, refer specifically but not exclusively on how I believe I touched on this briefly earlier, right, on how the students should communicate with the instructor, right? What kind of emails, clarification emails, right, should the student send to the instructor, for instance, if they have a question on what is covered at a certain stage of the course? How should the students raise questions or raise queries or raise clarifications during, say, a lab session, or say during a lecture session, or say during a tutorial session or a seminar session and so forth, right? What are the so these expectations have to be clear from the instructor's standpoint first, right? And then, of course, this brings us to the second big bullet point on this slide, right? Clear expectations. We may have this. I think all of us have expectations like that very clearly in our frame of mind, but that does not automatically equal to communicating these expectations clearly, right? So how do we communicate clear expectations clearly, right? So from my experience, right, I think I've learned that, communicating clear expectations clearly involves mainly, right, communicating these expectations either verbally or through email plainly at the right appropriate time. So plainly here means, right, that we be direct, we be clear, right, we be succinct. I wouldn't go so far as to say frank, right? But we be clear, we be direct, we be succinct with what it is we are trying to say to the students in terms of expectations, right, from the for the course. And we do so at the right appropriate time. Now, what does right appropriate time mean? Right, it depends on the context or the nature of the expectations. Say, for instance, we want to communicate how should students behave in a session, whether it be a lab session or a tutorial session or a lecture session, right? Then the right or appropriate time at which this set of expectations should be communicated to the students, right, should happen ideally before the course starts, right? so that students, before even coming to the lab or even before coming to the lecture or the tutorial would or should know, right? Should have a very clear idea of what your expectations are in terms of, say, how they should behave in these sessions. Now, of course, if the expectations here are on, how one should write a certain assignment or complete a certain assignment or clarify doubts on a certain assignment, then the right or appropriate time at which, this particular set of, expectations should be communicated to students would be at a time, just before, or maybe I wouldn't put out a hard and fast number, but, it should be before that assessments roll out or those assignments are released, right, to the students, right? So that students, before attempting the assessments or the assignments, have a clear idea of how they should reach out to you if they have any questions or doubts to clarify regarding the assignment or assessment, right? So that's what we mean, or what I mean by right appropriate time in terms of when to communicate, clear expectations plainly, right? So what does this achieve for us as instructors, right? I think this achieves, sorry for the slight pause there. I'm trying to move my Zoom bar so that I can see my slides. Okay, so what does this signal to the students, right? What does communicating clear expectations clearly do for us in terms of signaling, in terms of, its impact to the students, right? So when we communicate clear expectations clearly, right, this signals to the students that, in my experience at least, right, and I believe for many of us here, if not most of us here, right, that we are clear about what we expect from them. Right, when we communicate clear expectations clearly in whatever session that we are running, right, students should receive the signal, right, or should receive the impression that we are clear about what we expect from them. Our expectations are not only clear, but we deliver them clearly, right? And also doing this also signals to students that we are prepared to take queries from them on our expectations. I've learned from my own personal experience that when clear expectations are not communicated clearly, then students may become confused about what we expect from them. We may say, right, I think our expectations are clear, right? It's clear in a course outline, but very often students, they either may or may not read the course outline at the first instance, right? Or when a course starts, they may read it very later on, during the semester and so on. So, even though our expectations are clear, at least in our mind, and at least in how we design them, and even if it's on the course outline, right, students may still find themselves confused about what we expect from them. But when we communicate our clear expectations clearly, right, that sends, in my experience, I think for many, if not most of us, right, that it sends a signal to the students, right, that we are clear to them. They feel that it's clear about what we expect from them in terms of our course expectations. Also, it sends a signal to students, right, to them from their standpoint, that they feel that we are prepared to take queries from them on our expectations. It's one thing to communicate clear expectations clearly. I've learned that, right? It's quite another thing for them to perceive that we are prepared to take queries from them, right, on our course expectations, and communicating clear expectations clearly can help convince students, right, or signal to students, right, that we are actually prepared to take queries from them on our course expectations, right? We are not shut off from our students in terms of, whether or not they can ask questions about what we expect from them from our courses that they take, right? So these are just some, so just to wrap up on this first actionable strategy, right? These are some signals, right, that students can receive from their end, right? If we, in my experience, I think and I believe for many, if not most of us, right, as well, if we communicate clear expectations clearly. So the next actionable strategy here, right, is maintaining instructor presence. So let me unpack what the phrase instructor presence means, right, in due time. So first, of course, what is instructor presence, right? I think we hear this phrase a lot, especially those of us who are very heavily vested in pedagogical research, or have spent many years working in a classroom, right? So very quickly, what is instructor presence, right? Instructor presence, first and foremost, is not just about being physically present in a session, right? It goes beyond that, right? So from my experience, I've learned that instructor presence most generally, right, refers to students perceiving an instructor to be leading, facilitating, instructing the session, right? So instructor presence, instructor presence refers to students' perception, of an instructor to be leading or to be facilitating or to be instructing the session, right? So yes, it's perception based, right? So I think most, if not all of us here who have experience with pedagogy or have spent many years in a classroom, right, would I think have experience with this, right? How how well we teach, right? And that's a very generic phrase, in its own right. How well we teach, quote unquote. How effective our teaching is in terms of delivering the expected learning outcomes for the course that we are taking, right? Depends in part on whether students perceive us to be that way, right? Of course, in addition to how well they perform for assessments and so forth, right? But that perception part, how well the students perceive us to be, delivering the lesson that best positions them to achieve the learning outcomes of this lesson, plays a role in shaping how they view the lesson as a whole, how they view us as instructors, as whether or not we are effective instructors in that sense or not, right? Having said that, instructor presence is not impossible, but I would say difficult to quantify, right? In a definitive universal way, right? Simply because, and of course, this is not the only reason why that is so, but simply because, right? First of all, disciplines differ, right? And of course, stemming from that, the nature of the course content differs from discipline to discipline. And this means that the pedagogical approaches, right, that are used by the different disciplines differ accordingly. So instructor presence also differs accordingly as a result in terms of how you actually generate instructor presence and how to therefore quantify it, right? If possible, and it is possible, but difficult, right? Nevertheless, right, one way to sort of recognize instructor presence, or to sort of, I think the local lingo here is to, own self check own self, right? Or to put it in non-local lingual terms, right? One way to self-assess, right, whether there is visible instructor presence is to, observe when there is visible instructor presence in a session, students may say that they actually perceive, that means they actually verbalize, right, that they feel or they perceive, right, that the instructor is delivering the session or lesson plan effectively, right? So that's one way to sort of get feedback on whether there is visible instructor presence, right, that students, enough students, I would say, right, verbalize that, they perceive. So it's not just a feeling, it's a perception here that is based on their own understanding of what's transpiring on the ground in the lesson or in the session, right? That they perceive that the instructor is delivering the session or lesson plan effectively, right? So the next question that one may ask is, okay, so how do we maintain instructor presence, right? How do we create and maintain? So it's not just about creating instructor presence, but maintaining instructor presence, right? And here, in this second bullet point here, right, there are three non-exhaustive sort of approaches that I found useful from my own experience, right? I'm sure there are more, but the methods or the strategies on how to maintain instructor presence from my experience includes the following. The first is confident speech tone. Now, confident speech tone here, right, does not mean that we speak, does not simply mean that we speak very loudly, without regard for, the acoustics of the room or the sound atmosphere of the room and so on, right? It refers to the tone, right? And it's not so much about volume, it's about tone, confident speech tone, right? So are we confident about, in terms of speech tone, all right, about, the content that we are delivering within a particular session, whether it be instructions before the lab session starts, or instructions before the lecture starts, or lesson prompts before the tutorial starts, so on and so forth. Are we is our speech tone, right? Confident in that sense. It's not about volume per se, it's about tone, right? Do we come across in terms of our speech tone as being confident, sure, right? That we are certain, right? About what is it that we are about to share or present to our students. The next thing is, of course, volume, right? And here I included this point about a clear and appropriate speech volume because, right, the physical settings of the sessions that we run differ, right? Like we may be running a lecture, in which case, right, the physical space is quite big in for NT when we think about lecture theaters in NTU, or we are running a lab session, and of course the lab space may be relatively big or small depending on the lab class size, right? Same thing goes for tutorials, right? The tutorials classroom may be big or small depending on the tutorial size. So we would need to, I've learned from my own experience that having a clear and appropriate speech volume matters in terms of maintaining instructor presence. Now, what clear and appropriate means, it simply means whether students can hear us. Right, that's the first instance, whether our speech volume is high enough to a level that students can hear us, but at the same time, either not too soft that students, miss out important things that we are saying, and as well as not too loud that students feel that, okay, I'm feeling very overwhelmed by the volume in the classroom and so forth, right? So that's my take on clear and appropriate speech volume, right? Depending on the physical setting of the session that we are holding. It also clear and appropriate speech volume also includes, right, whether or not whether or not we can see that the students are registering what we are saying, right? So sometimes when students, I've had this many times in my own experience. I've given lectures, so just one-way delivery, and I've also done discussion-based tutorials, which is what we usually do in the social sciences as well as the humanities, right? Sometimes the volume level that we speak can be adjusted to increase engagement from the students, especially during a lecture, where especially the students feel very tired, right? After let's say if you have a lecture at 12:30 or 2:30 after lunch, right? Some students may feel tired and they may doze off. That may apply to lab or lab sessions or tutorial sessions respectively as well, right? So adjusting the speech volume to be at a clear and appropriate level also helps to keep students alert in that sense, right? And when students are alert and they're paying attention, right, they can perceive that or they may perceive as a result, right, that the instructor is actually delivering the lesson plan accordingly to the learning objectives, and that can in turn help to maintain instructor presence, right? Not the last, but the next point, of course, is appropriate eye contact, right? So human beings like us, human beings are, we are sensory creatures, right? I'm no, biological expert here, but from my own experience, practical experience of running classrooms in the kind of classrooms that I've run, right? Human beings are sensory beings, right? Like we respond to not just sound, but we respond also to visuals, right? We are that way, as instructors, when we view students, right? The kind of feedback that students give us, in terms of what they say, in terms of how they look, gives us feedback, right? In terms of whether or not they're actually understanding what we're saying. The same thing goes for students, right? Whether or not we are looking at them whether or not we have eye contact with them and so on, can have an impact on the students in terms of whether or not we are actually perceivably from that standpoint delivering the lesson in a way that is designed, right? So appropriate eye contact here is also, from what I've learned, crucial to maintain instructor presence, right? How students perceive how we engage in terms of eye contact with them, right? Appropriately, right? Plays a role in maintaining instructor presence. So let me go further by giving some non-exhaustive examples here. So an example of an appropriate eye contact can be, let's say we just finished or rather when we are giving instructions, say for a lab or before the lab starts, right? Are the students actually registering what we say? Excuse me, right? So we can do that by looking at the student. So eye contact, scanning the whole classroom or the whole lab room is one example, right? So if students look a bit dazed or a bit confused, if enough of them, right? And of course, there's no hard and fast number to this in terms of what counts as enough of them, right? But if we just cast our gaze across the lab room and we see that if most students look confused or befuddled or not or lost, that may send a signal to us, right? That okay, maybe I need to clarify certain lab instructions before I actually start the lab. So this is what I mean by appropriate eye contact, right? When we engage them through eye contact, right, we also get to see whether or not they are registering what we say. On the student side, when we register eye contact, students can it can also give students the perception that we are in session, right? The instructor is not just physically, right, but also in terms of delivering the lesson plan. The instructor is active, right, in terms of delivering the lesson plan in touch or aligned with the lesson objectives, right? So appropriate eye contact works both ways, right? And it can achieve these objectives, right? In terms of getting from our standpoint, right, ensuring that the students are registering what we say, and from the student standpoint, right, helping them or enabling them to feel that the instructor is watching, is looking, is concerned, right, is aware about whether or not they are actually registering what the instructor says, and all this can have an impact on maintaining instructor presence. So what does this do for students, for us as instructors, right? It signals to students that we are perceived as being prepared for the lesson. Now, in other words, in casual terms, right, it can mean, right, we know what we're talking about. Students can perceive, right, that us to know what we're talking about, right, when there's instructor presence being maintained. It can also signal to students that we are perceived as being committed to, or in applicable cases, passionate about, or have enough of a dedication or commitment, right, towards the cause, right? So when instructor presence is maintained, right, this can signal to the students that we are perceived as being prepared for the session, aka we know what we're talking about. So here, let me stress on the word perceive, right? Definitely, I think all of us, even before coming to the sessions, we prepare, right, before the session, whether it be a lab, a lecture, a tutorial, and so on. But whether or not students perceive us to be that way can be a whole different story, right? So I've learned from my own years, right, of running my own classrooms and courses. When instructor presence is maintained, right, it can result in students perceiving that we are prepared for the session, right? We know what we are talking about, right, for a particular lesson session, right? Students can also perceive that we are being committed to, right, or passionate about the course in applicable settings, or that we are dedicated to the course, right? That we are serious about, we are serious about, we care about the content that or the instructions that we are delivering to the students, right? The next actionable strategy is maintaining approachability, right? So here, let me, of course, like what I've done for the previous two actionable strategies, let me define some words here, right? So what is approachability? Right, first and foremost, it does not mean that the instructor and her or his students are friends, right? It by no means mean that. That's not what approachability means. So what does approachability mean, right? It instead most generally refers to the level of access, right, that the instructor allows to the student for consultations, as well as advancing queries or questions on the course. So that's what approachability means. In sum, or in essence, approachability means how much access, right, we as instructors give to the students to reach out to us for consultations or to raise questions or queries on the course or on the lab session or on the lecture content or on the tutorial content and so forth. So that's approachability. It's not about, the instructor and her or his students being friends, right? That's, I think, quite a common misconception, at least among students, right, about approachability, right? It does not mean that the instructor and her or his students are friends. So how do we maintain approachability, right? Again, these 2 pointers here, right? Again, I'm not exhaustive, right? This stem from my own experience, right? So maintaining approachability can be done through, being clear about your description, about your policy on consultations, as well as how your students should clarify queries, right? Now, some instructors they have a do list and a don't list, right? About how one should approach the instructor for consultations, as well as how one should raise queries or questions, and how to go about clarifying them. Of course, having a having a do's or don'ts list is not the only way to describe your policy on consultations and clarifying questions clearly, right? There are many ways, right? For myself, right, I verbalize them, is through slide pointers on, slides, right? There are many ways to do that. Some instructors that or colleagues that I know, right, they engage the students, right? They get the students' feedback first, right? So on how how everyone or all students within the classroom, right, should reach out to the instructor on consultations, as well as on clarifying questions or addressing queries on the course, right? So there are an innumerable number of ways, right, on how we can describe our policy on consultations and clarifying queries clearly, right? But maintaining approachability is not just about policy clarity and conveying that clearly to students. It's also about non-verbal cues during the session, right? So what do I mean by non-verbal cues during the session? So for instance, let's say, we come to a stage where we ask the students, let's say we just finished our first lab session, or first tutorial session, or first lecture, right? Then the instructor, like what we usually do, right? We ask, right? Does anyone have any questions, right, on what we have covered, on what is the expectations of the assignment or assessment they're supposed to complete, on the lecture content, and so forth, right? When non-verbal cues here can help to maintain approachability, right? Especially for students who are shy about let's say raising their hands, for instance, if they've actually questions or clarifications to address, right? So that's where non-verbal cues from the instructor standpoint can help. So what I've done, or what I've learned from my own experience, is that just having I usually smile. I try not to come across as looking too strict, right? So the instructor's facial expressions also can help, of course, right, in maintaining approachability. So smiling, walking around, of course, creating eye contact with students who look like who themselves give the expression that they may want to ask a question, but they may feel scared to ask a question, or they may feel inhibited from asking a question, can go a long way towards maintaining approachability, right? So non-verbal cues here, there are many ways, right? So smiling, facial expressions of the instructor, for instance, I mean, that's what I do, at least, right? I believe for many of us here, right? Walking around, right? Engaging, generating eye contact with students who look like they have a question to ask, but may feel scared to ask a question, right? Are just some examples, not exhaustive examples, but just some examples of non-verbal cues, right, that we as instructors can put out, right, to maintain approachability, right, during the session, or even at the end of the session, right? So what does this do for students, right? It signals to students that, again, that we are ready to listen to their questions, thoughts, and feedback about the course, right? And it also can signal to the students that we are ready to address their questions, and so on, right, about the course. It's one thing to have students perceive that we are ready to listen to their questions and so on about the course. It's quite another thing to have students perceiving that we are ready to address, right, their questions about the course. And from my own experience, maintaining approachability can go a long way towards signaling students that, one, we are not just ready to listen, but to address, right, questions, thoughts, feedback even that they may have about what we just covered, whether it be in the lab, or whether it be in the tutorial or the lecture, and so on. So the last actionable strategy for today is communicating real-time feedback clearly, right? And I think all of us here are no stranger to feedback. We release feedback for our assessments and so forth, right? So first of all, what's real-time feedback, right? We often hear this phrase. I think many of us, again, who have spent many years in a classroom, right, would have our own experiences with this. What's real-time feedback, right? First and foremost, real-time feedback does not mean hasty feedback, right? It does not mean give impulsive or hasty feedback, right? Which is, popular to what some people may, misunderstand about real-time feedback. Now, real-time feedback also does not mean generic or brief feedback, right? So what does real-time feedback means, right? Real-time feedback instead refers to timely, sometimes, not always, or even not often, but sometimes, depending on the situation, almost immediate verbal and or non-verbal feedback, right? For questions posed by students on the course, right? So timely feedback, what does it mean? Again, it depends on, what the feedback is meant to address, right? And then in turn depends on what the questions are that the students pose, whether it be a question or an assignment expectation, whether it be a question on how to complete an assignment, so on and so forth, right? The kind of questions posed by students can affect what we mean by timely feedback, right? So very quickly, for instance, let's say a student asks, right, at the end of a lab or tutorial session or lecture session, so what are the assessments I'm supposed to do, right? So for us, a timely feedback in my sense, right, can be verbal, right? So, okay, I just went through, right? Like for instance, right, the instructor may say something along the lines of, you're supposed to do this, to complete this course successfully, right? So that can be an example of timely feedback. Now, let's say if the student asks sends an email or asks, seeks verbal clarification on, let's say, a lab report that they submitted. How well they did for the lab report. Is it correct? Is it right? Or let's say a student submits an essay and so forth, and they ask us, right, how well do we think they did, right? Of course, in for such questions, right, then we need time to grade, or we need time to assess, right? So timely here would not mean, of course, right, almost immediate, right? It would mean that, the instructor needs to have enough time to go through the report and then come back with feedback, right? So the term timely here, right, there is no sort of fixed definition of what timely means, right? It depends first and foremost on what the question by the student is, right? And of course, that will shape in turn what kind of feedback we give, whether verbal or non-verbal. And of course, that has a bearing on what we mean by timely verbal and or non-verbal feedback. How to do this clearly, how to communicate real-time feedback clearly, right? So first, as instructors, what I've learned, I think all of us here, we do it in some measure, right? We understand the question posed by the student, right? And we clarify the question if needed. What is the query that the student is trying to address? Sometimes when they ask us such questions, it may not be clear to us, when a student asks us, right? Whether, maybe the language may not be clear, or they themselves may not even know, right? What is it they're trying to address? Sometimes it happens from the student's standpoint, right? It happens also via email as well, right? When a student writes an email to clarify, right? So though we understand the question or the query posed by the student, and we clarify the question if needed. Also, before communicating the feedback, right, for most, if not all of us here, I think we have some experience on this, right? We have a clear thought process about what we want to convey. So what is it that we want to communicate in terms of real-time feedback or timely feedback, right, to the student? So that thought process should be clear even before communicating the feedback, either through writing or verbally, right? And of course, when we release or communicate the real-time feedback, right, we engage in clear and concise speech or text, right? So the feedback should be clear, it should be concise, so that the students know exactly what is it that we are trying to convey to them in terms of feedback, right? And of course, when we give feedback, students want to feel assured, right? From my own experience, at least I believe for many, if not most, if not all of us here, right, from our own experiences, right, students want to feel assured that, okay, the feedback that they get is, this is something that I can work with in terms of further improving my own assignment if applicable, or for future assignments and so forth, right? So tone here also helps, right? So it's not just the words, but also the tone the tone of the communication. So when we come across as having a confident speech tone, right, when delivering real-time feedback, that plays, at least, in my experience, and I believe for many, if not most of us here, right, that goes a long way in, assuring the students may not share this, right, to you, but it can go a long way in assuring the students that, yes, this feedback, it's valid, it helps me I perceive that it helps me to further improve my achievement of the learning outcomes and so on. Right? Same thing goes with text. If let's say students write an email, right? Having a confident textual tone when releasing real-time feedback also goes a long way in achieving that end, which is namely, right? Students perceiving that yes, this email feedback helps me, right, to achieve the learning outcomes that I aim to achieve for this course. It helps me to do better, score better for an assignment, right, that I'm doing. So what does this all do in terms of signals to the students, right? Number one, it conveys or signals to the student when we communicate real-time feedback clearly, it signals to the student that we are actually listening to their questions, right? When we give real-time feedback, of course, as instructors, we feel that we are clear, right? But whether or not students feel that they are being listened to in terms of the questions that we pose, that they pose to us, can be a different story, right? So when we communicate real-time feedback clearly, it can signal to the students that we are, quote unquote, actually listening to their questions. And it can also signal to students that we appreciate, right, their questions or queries. And finally, and this is something that I think has come up, let me move my cursor. This is something that's come up in, I think, some of student feedback, right, over a period of time, right, that when we communicate real-time feedback clearly, it can signal to the students that we care enough about their learning progress. Like we care enough about, whether or not they understand what we say. We care enough about, they perceive that we care enough about what that we understand what they are trying to ask, and they perceive that we care enough about whether or not they learn the content that we hope that they learn from our course, right? So these are just some non-exhaustive actionable strategies that I sincerely hope that that is helpful to us in some way. And with that, thank you very much. We can now come to the Q&A segments, and I warmly welcome all questions and or comments. I will stop my screen share here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiang. So we invite any questions from the audience.
Hey.
If not, maybe I can start with a question of my own. I'm just referring to your very first strategy, I'd say, which is the about managing expectations and communicating expectations. I'm just wondering, do you have any exercise or part of it? Do you negotiate any of these expectations with your students, or is it more of a communicating with them?
Right. Thanks. Right. Sorry to jump in. Thanks, Steven, for that. I think this strategy is discipline neutral, right? So it first and foremost depends on the nature of the course, right? What the course is trying to cover. Now, for discussion-based tutorials, which is the one that I run, right? Because students are supposed to engage in class discussions and in an in-depth conversation about the class content when the class, when the class starts to unfold, right? Then it would make, quote unquote, for perhaps for lack of a better phrase, right, pedagogical sense to involve the students in terms of communicating what they expect, right, or what they hope to achieve from the course. Now, of course, this is by no means exclusive only to discussion-based tutorials. Non-discussion-based tutorials or lab settings can also involve that. But I think it would the instructor would have to exercise judgment in terms of involving the students, right, on management of expectations or communicating of expectations clearly from the instructor's standpoint to students, and how if they want to involve students in a process. It depends on what the instructor wants to achieve from the course. Like I said, it depends on the nature of the course, right? What is the course content that the course is trying to convey? What are the learning outcomes that the instructor hopes to achieve from the course? Not all of them may be, student interactive in terms of learning objectives, right? That can have an impact on whether or not the instructor may make the judgment to involve students more, right, in the process of communicating expectations clearly. So yes, it can be an interactive exercise, but it can also be less of an interactive exercise, more of a, at least in the initial instance, right, more of a one-way communication between the instructor and the student. If let's say the instructor wants to set what we call set the climate, set the stats, set the atmosphere, right, in terms of classroom expectations clearly from the start. So it depends also on what the instructor wants to achieve in that sense. So yes, it can be interactive, right? It can be communicative, but it can also be less of that. It depends on what the instructor wants to achieve for the course. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have a question in the Q&A option. So
Right.
it's from Bama.
Okay,
Excuse
so
me.
thanks. I'm reading. I think this is a public comment. So I think if may I read this out so that
Yes, please
everyone.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I think Pamela asks, right? Thanks for the talk. Most welcome. Thank you for attending, and for your time. I'm curious to know what specific difficulties you have faced or what issues students have brought up and how you managed to overcome them. So that is a very timely question. Thanks for that. Now, let me preface by saying why I did not address it in my talk, right? So the purpose of this talk is to sort of advance discipline neutral actionable strategies, right? And admittedly for myself, right, I come from a very social science classroom environment where these tutorials are small classroom size discussion based, very active discussions, in-depth conversation, and so on. So that informs the kind of difficulties that I have faced, which may not be the kind of difficulties that my colleagues from other disciplines may face. So, but to address that question, right? I think general I mean, not just general enough, but specific difficulties that I think all of us have faced, not just myself, right, regardless of which discipline we may come from, apathy. So apathy in terms of lack of interest, indifference, unfortunately, to the course content. I'm not sure why here, especially if we teach core courses, right, that or major core courses that students have to take, whether or not they like it or not, right, we may face apathy. I just don't care about the course content, right? I don't know why I'm here, right? I don't know why am I doing this? Why am I learning, let's say, how to calculate calculus when let's say if let's say if I'm interested in in a practical aspects of maritime engineering, for instance. Why do I have to calculate learn how to do coding, for instance, which is something that one of my ex-students have raised. I mean, for confidentiality, I'll not say the name, but that's something that came up. Why am I learning coding when I'm learning and of course I believe the instructor for this course has explicated the reason why they are learning coding, but students may ask these questions nonetheless or regardless, right? Why am I learning this when I thought I want to achieve that or learn that? So apathy, indifference, lack of understanding of why, apathy, indifference towards the course content. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is, why am I learning this? I can't see the relevance of what I'm learning towards my own potential, learning goals or future career goals. So the relationship, the ambiguous relationship between something that they are asked or requested to do for a course vis-a-vis or in relation to what they want to achieve in terms of their university time in NTU as well as their future career goals is another challenge, right? So I think I stop at two. Of course, there are more, but I think in terms of general enough, but still specific difficulties that we as instructors face in our courses, regardless of the disciplines that we are in, is includes one, apathy towards or indifference towards the course content. Second is, of course, relevance, right, between what they're asked to do and what they want to achieve for themselves, either educationally or for their future careers. How do I go about addressing that? Again, it varies, right? I try to explicate the rationale. I mean, of course, it sounds instrumental, but I think it's important that the instrumental part of why students learn something, instrumental means here, right, that what's the tangible objective, right, of going through a particular assignment is important for students to understand and to really register. We may say it, as instructors, and I believe we all do say it. I mean, I think all of us do say it, in our courses, but whether students register that is another question, right? So I try to repeat and explicate this in class time and or during the session and outside of the session, if I ever run into them or see them, So also, what I've done is, when I run into them outside, just chatting with them, asking how they understand the course helps. So for instance, okay, how do you feel about the course? We don't just ask about whether they have completed the assessments and so on, right? So we have to ask them, how do you feel about the course? Are you keeping up? Are there any, queries that you may have, ones that it's not burning questions in their minds that they may not have the time to write an email to clarify on, right? Or to ask during class. But if you run into them outside of class, right, that's what I also try to do, right? To ask them, right, if they have time, of course, outside of class, right, to address these queries. Yeah. So I think in my experience, that goes a long way in helping to sort of, clarify or even reduce the ambiguity between why they are doing something in relation to what they want to achieve for their university education as well as for their future careers, right? And of course, why study the content, right? Why are they doing this course, right? And then of course that aims to help reduce apathy or indifference to the course content. Yeah. So I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. I think just taking note of time, we are at 12 p.m. So I think I'll just end the session officially. We can hang around to answer any questions which any of the audience may have. And but in any case, thanks everyone for
Thank
being
you.
a part of today's session. And we hope you have a great Friday afternoon and a weekend ahead. And yes, I think we can continue with question and answers.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.